Welcome, everybody. My name is Steve Dyson. I'll introduce myself here in a minute. But the talk that we're going to have today is around the cyber defense matrix and how it can help with compliance readiness. And as we were discussing a little bit before, kind of the pain point, especially on more of the security team, the defensive side of, great, cool, we're compliant, but what does that actually mean for me? Who am I? My name is Steve Dyson. I'm a cybersecurity director at Echelon Risk and Cyber. I work in our risk advisory practice. Been in true cybersecurity now for a little over 11 years. Started out in the incident response side of the house as an IR consultant. Built out the security operations team for a mid-sized regional healthcare system in the Philadelphia area. Prior to joining Echelon Risk and Cyber, I was with Palo Alto Networks Unit 42 for a little over 4 years. And prior to coming into cyber, I worked in law enforcement and the military. Big kind of where I have a passion, especially when we're talking compliance. I graduated law school 2 years ago. Really just wanted to be more effective with communicating with lawyers, especially in the consulting space. And again, kind of bridge that gap between the true urgency on the defensive side with the more the compliance, the checkbox side, and the kind of shielding of incident response within the lawyering. So what are the problems that we're really trying to talk about today? Too many tools, not enough clarity. Many cybersecurity programs have 50, 100, 200 different tools, different security controls. And there isn't really a good understanding of how they actually integrate together and how they actually build an integrated full defense. Oftentimes there's pressure from leadership. Sean Thomas had a great talk yesterday afternoon, and one of the questions was around metrics. Metrics are great. Metrics are a great way of communicating things, but what matter to the defender doesn't necessarily matter to leadership and vice versa. And it's really hard to bridge that gap of what actually matters to the other. Oftentimes as well on the leadership side, the problem of I didn't have any incidents this month or I had minimal alerts. They see that as why am I spending money on this? We see it as things are working well. A good security program is going to result in a lot of zeros. That's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. That means that the spend is working. But on the leadership side, they see a bunch of zeros and they think, well, why am I paying for this or why am I paying you? What we're going to talk about here today is hopefully going to help kind of bridge that gap as well. Tool sprawl usually results in a lot of redundancy, a lot of things looking at the same either asset class, same type of information, or reporting on the same things. And occasionally you can have conflicting information from those as well. So the CDM here isn't necessarily just about visibility into what do my defenses look like and where are their gaps. It can also be, hey, I have 20 things that are looking at this exact same thing. Do I really need all 20 things? And then finally, regulatory pressure. There's been a number of new regulations, a number of new frameworks over the last 5+ years. And interestingly, a lot of them are actually putting more pressure on the defenses, which is a good thing. It means that people are listening, that regulations are actually putting in things into stuff that matters, not just trying to get away from kind of the check marks exercise, but it also puts a lot of pressure into the answers. How are we actually doing this? What are we doing with this? How are we making sure that it isn't just a check mark exercise? So to that end, we run into the compliance trap. So over the last 2-ish years, 83% of breached organizations were compliant at the time of breach. What does that mean? Well, compliance doesn't necessarily mean I have good defenses or I'm going to be resilient in the face of a breach or nothing bad is going to happen. Some of that is just the inevitability of breaches are going to happen, attacks are going to happen, bad things are going to happen. There is no truly pure defense. But the other side of the coin is just because I pass that audit or just because I say I'm compliant doesn't mean that I'm going to be resilient. Big box there. Zero compliance certifications prevent breach. So again, just because I have a SOC 2, just because I passed ISO 27001, just because I have any of the other litany of either frameworks, compliance, standards, again, doesn't mean that I'm actually going to prevent anything bad from happening. I need to have the strong underlying defenses. So, really, if you think about compliance is more of a backward-looking exercise. So over the last year, over the last X amount of time, this is how compliant I am. This is how I complied with either the requirements or the controls of the associated framework or regulation. Security is more forward-looking. How are we preparing for what comes next? I'm more worried about next week than I am about last week. So with that in mind, who here is familiar with the cyber defense matrix? Couple hands, awesome, you guys are ahead of the game. So what is the cyber defense matrix? Suno Yu created the original CDM back in 2014. It is a powerful tool for understanding your defenses and building a better path towards cybersecurity maturity. If you think about it as a matrix here, the top are going to be functional areas. So really, the different stages of either, detection, lifecycle, whatever you want to call it. The original CDM aligned to NIST CSF 1.0, so we have identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And then the rows are asset classes. So what am I actually looking at? What are the things that I'm looking at? We'll get into a little bit more later in the presentation, but the asset classes are also flexible. So you can shift them, you can change the terminology to really align to your organization or the priority, or if we're talking a specific compliance framework, what is the urgency in that compliance framework? What are the assets that really fall into that? Terminology here, we say assets, oftentimes assets means something a little bit different depending on who you're talking to. Really, when we're talking about asset classes here, you can think about it as types of things that we're protecting. Most programs focus on the first two, endpoint and networks. Oftentimes, there's a little bit of a trail off for the others. Some programs are more robust and have better coverage, some are not. But again, if you just think about it as it's the multi-layered approach to all the different things that are important to my organization. The exercise that you then do for the CDM is the cross-mapping. So for this function and this asset class, what do I have in place from a security control or a tool perspective to actually protect this? An area where oftentimes people lack are they're not true with what's the maturity of this thing. Like just because I have a tool doesn't mean that it's working well. Oftentimes with the technology question, it's technology is up here and everything else is down over here. As long as I have a technology, it's robust. Not looking at, is there anybody looking at it? Is it tuned? Can I actually see what's going on? Do I have alerting? Is anybody actioning those alerts? Do they sit there for a month? That's not an effective tool. So again, when you're filling out the CDM, you need to be true with yourself and you need to be true with the capability of the control that you're looking at. Again, you'll see governance is missing. So the govern function from NIST CSF 2.0. We'll touch on that here in a little bit, but govern is important, and govern doesn't just simply mean being papered to death here. It's really, if I have a tool, is there a person? Is there a process? Is there a way of using this either with the rest of my program or even independently by itself to actually get something out of it? Again, a tool that's there, we kind of live in a field now where the technology people are, hey, you have this, you are forever protected. Or my favorite, when I was with Palo Alto Networks was, hey, if you use XIM, you're going to be SEC compliant. Fantastic. The SEC doesn't require you to have a SIM. It requires you to understand what's happening, do your breach notification, again, take action, but it doesn't require you to have a SIM. So how is your SIM making you SEC compliant? It's not. So, oftentimes we're hearing all this fluff, but leadership is getting it even worse. And all they're hearing is all you need is this tool and all of your compliance problems are out the window. That's not true. And again, a CDM is a really good way of showing them, great, cool, you have this tool, it satisfies this cell, it satisfies this cell, we're missing all of this. So, CDM and compliance itself. What are some compliance problems? Life cycle imbalance. Security budgets are often focused more on identify and protect. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The earlier you can catch something, the earlier you can identify, the less I have to worry about the other functions. But you can't also just ignore those other functions because, hey, I'm going to identify it quickly or I'm protected. It doesn't matter if I can't detect it. You need to have a well-balanced program. It's always going to shy kind of one way or the other, and I would say if you're going to shy one way or the other, shy more towards the left, towards identify and protect. But again, you want that full coverage. Oftentimes for most programs, 70 to 80% of the spend actually goes into identify and protect. And oftentimes there as well, that spend is focused more on network and endpoint, kind of ignoring the other asset classes. Paper controls, the audit artifact problem. Controls are designed to satisfy auditors. So my program is set up that I pass the audit, or I have the evidence that I need to pass the audit. I don't really care if it's working. I don't care if I have continuous monitoring. I don't care if it's going to work next week. Right now, I have what is needed to pass that audit. And it's kind of hell or high water, I'm passing that audit. The CDM works to operationalize that compliance. So, you can't just point to a tool or a process or a team that fills the cell. It's robust. It's meant to be full. As well as as you do it truthfully, you're going to see some cells that are empty. And those are really the ones that, hey, does this actually matter to my organization? Do I actually need to have something here? Or is that okay? You don't have to fill in every cell, and not every cell needs to be the most mature. But again, you need to make sure that you have that answer of, is this actually important to the organization? Is this going to cause a problem by the gap being there? And then finally, the main value proposition here for using the CDM hand in hand with compliance is the compliance is a checklist. The CDM here is meant to be a coverage map. So by joining those together, I'm doing both. I'm passing that audit, but I'm also seeing my compliance across the board. Like I'm seeing it as an effective cybersecurity program. So this is, of the frameworks that we're going to discuss here in a second, this is really the synthesis of all of them combined. So kind of the average that you see based on the requirements of the frameworks. And you'll see right side, a lot of red and a lot of yellow. So with respond and recover, most of the frameworks don't have robust coverage there. They might have, hey, you need a DRP, you need to have an incident response plan. It's very basic. If you think of NIST CSF, it really kind of trails off with respond and recover. There's controls there, there's subcategories, but they're not the most robust, and they're kind of basic. Do I communicate if there's an incident? Do I have roles and responsibilities defined? All those are well and good, but what all can go into that from a security control and technology perspective? Oftentimes it's just kind of, these are people problems. I have a plan, I have people, that's all I need. Or they're farmed out to a third party, which again is fine, but how am I answering what our program can do, what our organization can do to actually answer these? So again, you kind of see that trail off, and you also see a trail off as you move down with the asset classes, so specifically around detect, where oftentimes there's robust detections for endpoint, and I would say users are kind of hit or miss depending on the program, but usually network and endpoint, we got a lot of robust controls, a lot of visibility, and then we kind of trail off as we go into the other asset classes. So the crosswalk in the frameworks itself, and really don't think about this as how the CDM is going to make me compliant. Think about this as, hey, we want compliance in this. How is the CDM, especially for the boots on the ground, the people that are doing the work, how is this going to make me sleep better, the fact that we say that we're compliant? Again, for most, when I was in SecOps, a lot of time, okay, cool, I worked in healthcare, great, we're HIPAA, yay, what does that actually mean for me? How is this going to make life any better? Or just because we have that, does it actually work? The CDM is answering that. So this is really more of the assurance on your side, hey, the program is working, as well as that answer and the ability to go to leadership and say, hey, you say we're compliant, we passed the audit, that's all well and good, but we have this glaring gap. We do need more spend, we do need more value in this area. So with that in mind, mapping to NIST CSF 2.0, the first glaring gap with the current CDM, govern. Govern isn't there. That is an area, if you're looking to align to NIST CSF 2.0, make sure that you're including govern in that consideration. Govern you can really think of as overarching across the other 5 functions. So you can make it a standalone column, or you can make it just kind of as the overarching column across all of the other 5. Generally speaking, the govern function is also looking to shift the accountability up to the board level. So governance across the entire organization, really taking ownership up to that leadership position. And again, the CDM can help clarify to them, hey, this is what we currently have, this is what we're actually doing, versus again, just the result of an audit. When you think about this as well is, the NIST CSF 2.0 is typically going to be your starting point. So most organizations, this isn't the sole either framework or regulation or compliance function that they're looking to map to. This is just a good way of either translating that from a control perspective, or again, just as a starting point of, hey, I want to get a base CDM built. This is a really good starting point. Other ones that commonly come into play, especially from a starting point, ISO 27001 and the CIS controls. For ISO 27001, typically here we're going to be thinking Annex A. Annex A has 93 controls. So, again, if we're talking from a function perspective here, we got a lot of controls and they pretty much all fall into identify and protect. So, again, great, ISO 27001. My left side of my CDM is packed full. My right side is a little lacking at this point from a visibility standpoint. So again, just making sure that you're getting that full visibility. CIS controls are somewhat dependent on which implementation group you're talking about. So if we're talking IG1, we're again focused on identify and protect. As we introduce IG2 and IG3, we're starting to fill that out a little bit more. So again, just from a visibility standpoint, the CDM is going to give you better visibility. Oftentimes with just kind of as an aside on the CIS front, if you have an organization that's looking to either implement CIS or is already using it, I personally like to go with the halves. So you do a 1.5 or a 2.5. What that's going to do is it's going to allow you to have a little bit more robust coverage across the 18 controls versus just the 15. So making sure that you have a little bit more visibility. While the CIS controls don't specifically map one-to-one with the functional areas within CDM, the CIS is a little bit more tailored towards that technology side. So again, it's going to be a little bit better with hey, I have this, the answers to that assessment or that self-assessment is going to be a little bit easier to map within the CDM itself. And again, it gives you more strength in either those observations or if there are gaps identified, you can either come back and say, hey, the gap doesn't exist because we have this control, or great, that gap doesn't exist. Here's that corresponding gap in our security controls. What do you propose that we do about it? So, again, have more evidence for that leadership discussion. And then finally, moving into more of kind of the regulated side of things. First is DORA. I'd say this is one that isn't necessarily as relevant to a lot of US-based organizations, but based more on EU specific. But if you're operating out of the EU, definitely something to keep account of. What's interesting with DORA is it almost maps one-to-one with the areas that the CDM is looking at. It's almost the purest translation of a CDM into a regulation. Generally speaking, that means, hey, they're probably thinking along the same lines here. We're looking at resilience as part of DORA, so it's going to be more of the recover focus. In fact, it's probably the only one that I'm aware of that is that heavily focused on the recover side. So really, the stronger side on this one is actually the right side versus the left side. One area, though, with this CDM, from an asset class perspective, is DORA is very focused on supply chain and third-party risk management. So this is one of those areas where you may want to add an asset class or shift your asset classes to include that view into third-party risk management or supply chain. So, again, keep in mind the CDM is flexible. Make sure that it fits your organization and what you're looking at from a regulatory or framework perspective. Within recover, most frameworks, most regulations treat that as aspirational. DORA doesn't. It's a mandatory requirement. So again, having that visibility, having that ability to fill that in with a robust view. The other thing that DORA requires is threat-led penetration testing. Again, an area where a lot of organizations aren't necessarily doing it internally. They're typically farming that out to a third party. But there are specific requirements, and there is a way to really map what you're doing within that penetration testing within the CDM, across the different asset classes and making sure that you're covering all the required areas. Go. CMMC, becoming kind of an urgent thing for many organizations that either didn't realize they were part of the defense industrial base or were really hoping that it didn't actually come into play. Similar to DORA, where's the focus area that the asset classes are really missing? Third-party risk management, supply chain. The cascading effect from defense industrial base organization down the line in supply chain, that is an area that you also need to look at as you're building out a CDM or as you're looking at CMMC compliance. Somewhat dependent here, especially from a CDM perspective, if we're going level 1, level 2, or level 3. So with level 2 and level 3, kind of the mandatory function here, the fact that it has teeth versus the self-assessment, Still important to do that CDM, but obviously it's more important there, especially from a continuous monitoring perspective. What do I actually have in place? Like, what is the evidence that I have, especially from an assurance perspective internally? How am I making sure that what I'm saying on paper is actually in place? That's kind of the quickest way for a lot of organizations have gotten themselves in trouble with CMMC is by either over-promising within their audit or their assessment, or again, assuming that things are in place and not really having that view into what actually is in place. Data here is going to be that primary asset class related to controlled and classified information. So COI is really the driving force of CMMC. So if you're looking to comply with CMMC and you're doing your CDM, data should be big box around it. This is the area that I need to have the most robust controls in. It will fawn out into the other asset classes because obviously it follows the data, but keep in mind it follows the data. So the data is going to be the driving force here of either the enclave that I need to make sure that I have those robust security controls in, or at least that starting point. So if I start with controls on the data and then work my way out, I'm going to be in pretty good shape here. If you're leading up into, say, level 2 or level 3, a good kind of pause here would be to actually do that CDM. So, especially if you're not part of that direct audit, do your CDM, be able to have those answers. And that's a really good time, again, to have that leadership discussion of, hey, we want CMMC. These 3 things are going to prevent us from actually obtaining it or prevent us from maintaining it and not potentially getting a fine. This is the time to spend on it. Similarly, FedRAMP, again, government focused. This maps a little bit better with the CDM because the baseline is 853. Control perspective really depends on if we're talking moderate or high, which is really going to be driven by the intended use there within the cloud. But again, really focused on application for asset classes and data. Again, I did a little bit easier to kind of map to the true CDM without a lot of movement there. But as you're doing this, really focus on obviously the cloud. So that's the other thing with the CDM is focus on the area that the requirements are pushing you towards. FedRAMP isn't a requirement across your entire program. It is per se, but really we're talking about the cloud specifically here in the application. If that doesn't come into play for your entire enterprise, then that's not something that I necessarily need to look at with the CDM. So in theory, you could have multiple CDMs, across the different frameworks or compliance needs of your organization. Here, continuous monitoring, so specifically the detect function, is a requirement, similar to the CMMC front. So, you saw kind of that tail off with the example, the crosswalk, where as I'm moving out of endpoint and networks, it kind of tails off on the detection side. You need to make sure that you have robust detections here, especially cloud-specific detections if we're talking FedRAMP. SEC Cybersecurity Rule. I'm not going to lie, this is probably my favorite. It probably scared the bejesus out of most organizations and most people when it first came out of how am I going to report this within 4 business days? Or what am I actually going to say? Why I like it is one of the few regulations that kind of takes the burden off the security team and puts it on leadership. Leadership tries to funnel it down. We had some organizations where, we're building an incident response plan with them and they're like, hey, leadership needs me to make the materiality decision. Hell no. If leadership is asking you to make a materiality decision, 100% push back. If you need to call me, I will gladly yell at them because materiality should be with the business. Not with the security team. Security team can provide evidence, they can provide information on what's occurring, but the materiality of the business needs to be with the business, not with the security team. This is one area where the CDM doesn't really satisfy the requirements here of the SEC cybersecurity rule, but it does provide more evidence into this is why we can't comply, or this is why we can't give you that answer of what's occurring. The other thing is it gives you the assurance of the program is working, so I can actually give leadership those answers to be able to be compliant here. This also gives you a lot of evidence where, again, if you're lacking on that respond and recover side, hey, we will fail at this. We will not be able to comply. We are likely going to get a fine. We're likely going to get pushback from the SEC if we file our 8K or 10K, and that's a problem. So again, this can be a nice quiver in your, or arrow in your quiver to really get either that spend or, push on this is why we need, X, Y, and Z. Again, detect function here is probably going to be your most important because obviously the sooner we can detect something, the sooner I can actually say something bad has happened, and then we can file our, notification of incident, within that 4 business day timeline. PCI DSS, payment card specific. A lot of PCI DSS is really going to be that protect function. So tokenization, encryption, HSMS, key management. Protect column is going to be very dense. And again, oftentimes that's going to be that first 3 asset classes, network, endpoint, and data. And then kind of a fall off from a user perspective, again, for most programs here. Where things start to kind of fall off are in the respond, where oftentimes for most payment card organizations, the notification that a breach occurred is MasterCard or Visa reaches out. Oftentimes there isn't necessarily that same visibility into their CDE, into, hey, something happened, something was moved out, or I don't have an answer of how large it was. Like I know something happened, I don't quite know what happened or what cards were impacted, or maybe I just put my head in the sand and say, like, it was impacted, but I didn't see any data leaving, so nothing bad happened. And then Visa or MasterCard reach out. So, again, it's a nice practical exercise to make sure that, hey, are the defenses where they should be, and do I have an answer if something bad happens? Whoa. HIPAA. HIPAA security rule is going to be the best, kind of mapping here of the CDM. Privacy omnibus, privacy especially, there isn't much of an overlap if we're talking, cyber defenses, more so just can I detect a breach has occurred and can I give the answer of how many records were impacted. So really, focus here on the security rule. We have 3 safeguard categories with the caveat of HIPAA 2.0 might be changing some of this, so this is active as of right now, subject to change, but the safeguard categories, administrative, physical, and technical. Technical is obviously going to be the best mapping here if we're talking the CDM. But again, it's not a true one-to-one. So similar to PCI DSS, it's not going to be a great, like, hey, this is specifically the functional areas that I'm looking at. But more so, it's going to give you, again, that assurance that I can detect something has happened, I can respond to it. I'm not necessarily as specifically tied to identify and protect. And that's really where most healthcare lives, is identify and protect. They're very reactive. They're prone to not having a good answer into kind of the record side. And you'll see that a lot with again, the privacy notifications where the public statement is, hey, 1 million records were breached here or 1 million records were impacted. And then a week later, they do further investigation, and it's really only 150. Nobody cares about the second conversation. They care about, hey, 1 million records were breached here. Nobody really looks at that first or the second number there. So again, the better you can have a handle on the detect and respond, the better clarity you can give for these conversations and put leadership in a better light. So what are some things to kind of keep in mind here as you're looking at compliance in the CDM? Asset inventory. So the asset class rows are configurable. You should align them to your organization. You should align them to your industry or the framework that you're specifically wanting to look at. And again, some of this is going to translate between frameworks, some of it will not. And it's fine here to have a couple different CDMs across a couple different frameworks here if that's what your organization is using. Making sure that, if you're financial services specifically looking for CMMC, a recommendation would be to add in an additional asset class for third-party risk management or supply chain. Again, making sure that you have that visibility. We were talking AI before. If you're an AI organization, some of your assets may change there from an asset class perspective as well. So again, you may want to add different ones. We'll actually touch on a different framework here for AI here shortly. Current state honesty. The more honest you can be about what's going in there, the better results you can get. Like the CDM is not the time to be wishy-washy. The CDM is the time to be, take the rose-colored glasses off and be as transparent as you can into the effectiveness. The intent of the CDM is to be a view into the actual defenses, but also using it for the conversation that you need to have of why. Why do I need something? Because again, typically leadership is, why do you need that? We haven't had an incident in 6 months. Well, we haven't had an incident in 6 months because we got lucky, because if you look here, respond is completely empty. We don't have anything that falls into there. So it's really giving you that pushback. Oftentimes with the CDM, and sometimes this is difficult for organizations, you probably want to do it with at least 2 people to have point-counterpoint. Again, doing it by yourself is perfectly fine, but if you can have another person that either disagrees with you or, hey, play devil's advocate. I hate to say this, but you could even use, if you're by yourself, use a chatbot or AI to just, hey, play the role of counterpoint. Argue with me. Tell me why this might not fit into this cell. I'd be a little careful of what information you're providing, but again, if you need someone to push back on you, just make sure that there's somebody on the other side so that you're actually coming to that true point. Compliance overlay. Multiple frameworks are really where the CDM plays dividends in audit preparation. So when your CISO is asking you, are you compliant, you can really answer that to the affirmative or to the negative in a visual manner with the CDM. So again, it isn't just, hey, yes, we're going to pass the audit, but here's the counterpoint. This is where we failed from a defensive program perspective. Gap reading. So prioritization here really is an art. Again, like I said, you're going to have multiple gaps and you're going to have multiple strengths. Not everything needs to be in the green. Not everything needs to be the most mature. Make sure you're strategizing your gaps based on actual need, either from a compliance perspective or, again, just from a program perspective. We'll touch on how you can help kind of get some visibility into those gaps here in a second. But mine that I usually like to align to if we're having these conversations are look at your threat landscape, look at your threat profile. Where are there areas that actually might be used against me? And where are there ones where, hey, we have such robust controls, say on the protect side, that like the likelihood of this occurring is pretty small. There might not be the need to spend a lot on the respond for that asset class, but I might have better spend elsewhere. And then finally, reporting. Really, the matrix itself is generally speaking board ready. You are going to have to explain probably, what do I mean by asset class here? What do the functions mean? So there's definitely some preparatory work that needs to go into explaining it. But generally speaking, you have a heat map that you can show, and they're going to see a bunch of red or gaps, and their immediate response is going to be, how do we close those? So it is really a nice way of kind of translating a fairly easy exercise into, generally speaking, a board-ready presentation, obviously with some cleanup. So, great, we understand the CDM. What are some things that I can do with the CDM or expanding upon the CDM to, again, better answer some of those questions? What I came up with was the cyber posture map. Generally speaking, I sort of a CDM 2.0. Really additional function here of govern, so really looking at govern across the board. And then providing sub-information for within the cells. So, if we're talking, identify across network, what things or what types of technology would generally fall into those areas. What it allows you to do is actually kind of plug and play multiple items across multiple cells, but then also get better visibility into, the program doesn't necessarily build in a way where we're mapping network to identify, but we might be looking at threat intelligence, or we might be looking at asset inventory. Getting a better visibility into, what we commonly would call things into where they would generally fit within the cyber defense matrix. Also provide here maturity scoring. So again, when I'm doing these with either an organization or on my own, I also like to provide kind of multi-layered maturity. So not necessarily just, is it in place, is it not in place? We do want to look at the quality of that. We say quality, and most SecOps is going to go to, is the tool good? I'm less concerned about that when I'm talking, maturity here, and it's more, do I have a tool? Is there a person that can look at it? Do I have detections? Again, the quality of the tool itself. You can overlay the actual, does this tool work well? Especially if you're doing this in your own organization of, hey, I have this tool that you dumped on me and it's awful. This is a good way of kind of counterbalancing that point. The other one that I've been working on is an AI CDM matrix. I will caveat with this is a 100% a work in progress. This is not the final state. But again, kind of remapping those asset classes into what would usually go into a typical AI usage. The intent of this is again, this isn't meant to be a full program view into your full enterprise, but it's more specific to AI. What is my program doing? Similar functions, identify, protect, respond, and recover with govern over top. And again, you'll see here for most organizations, we're really left heavy, especially for, I would say they're left heavy, but again, there's a lot of gaps on the left-hand side as well. Again, it's just kind of trying to rethink what defenses, what things can go into, kind of your AI security. A driving force for this, I would say, is more into the types of attacks and less so the threat actor themselves. Yes, there are novel approaches, and yes, there are different techniques that are used by different threat actor groups if we're talking targeting AI. But generally speaking, pick something like OWASP Top 10, MITRE ATT&CK. Again, align more to the techniques when you're providing those answers versus kind of the true threat actor at this moment in time. And again, caveat, work in progress. If you see anything that you think would be great to add, please let me know, because 100% want to make this better. And then finally, as I said, not to shout out Sean Thomas again, but great talk yesterday, for the threat and detection lifecycle. That's another way of really adding in another layer to the CDM. So if we think about it from compliance to CDM, what comes after that? So compliance, again, the checkbox. Rearward looking, how did I do over the last X period of time? Security CDM, forward looking, what can I do in the future? Attack, detect, and defend. So the kind of the MITRE suite is a way of kind of layering on the extra there. So attack, the offensive lens, what are the likely threats facing my organization? What are the TTPs that are going to be used? Defend, more of the defensive counterpart. Structured vocabulary for the defensive side. So, kind of the counterpoint to attack. And my personal favorite, which is detect, which is the operational bridge. So I'm looking at the quality of my log sources, I'm looking at my custom alerting use cases and providing that answer of, from an attack standpoint, what is likely going to be used against me? From a defend perspective, what do I have in place and what can it do to kind of counterpoint those TTPs? And then from a detect perspective, where are there potentially gaps within the underlying logic behind those defenses to provide those answers? So again, if I'm doing something like this, this is where you're really getting the effectiveness of the tool. So again, I might have a SIM and it might be the best SIM in the entire world, but I don't have any data sources. So I can't actually detect anything and I can't alert on anything, so it's not that good. Detect and defend are really going to help provide those answers. And again, that extra layer here. I like to use this back in my SOC days of a way of just kind of a thought exercise for especially more junior people. Get to know our tools. Get to know what we can do and what we can't do. And again, take that CDM and kind of translate that into what we can actually see and what we can actually do. This can help from a prioritization standpoint as well as just an overall quality perspective. So, if you think about it as your CDM is your strategic posture map, attack is your threat model, defend is your countermeasure library, and detect is your operational scorecard. So finally, as noted, when you're doing your CDM, be as specific and actionable as you can. Don't just say, go use the CDM. If you're going to do it, make sure that you're aligning to a framework. Make sure that's a priority for your organization with the framework. Make sure that you're looking at the specific controls. Be honest with yourself with your security controls. If there is a gap, treat this as a way of really providing evidence of why that gap needs to be closed. So if you think about compliance frameworks tell you what is required. The CDM tells you where you stand with those requirements from a security control perspective. Generally speaking, the universal blind spots are going to be detect, respond, and recover. And specifically for most frameworks, detect and recover. Usually those are going to be very underpopulated and also an area where most of the frameworks don't have a lot of good controls around, kind of answering how robust those defenses are. And then finally, the matrix can serve as a shared language between security teams, executives, and auditors. Again, translating those requirements into a common language. and putting actual security controls behind it versus just simply wishy-washy, I have something maybe, and I'm checking that box. So, any questions that anyone has? Yes.
It sounds like from your description, this is more taking existing compliance frameworks and mapping them to this matrix. Do you do anything in part of the process to like you're assuming that as part of your compliance, you said you had a SIM that will detect these types of attacks and alert your team, SOC or whatever, but is there any part of this process or matrix that helps you actually validate that your SIM's working as intended?
So, the question is, how to kind of bridge the gap beyond just, is there something in place with the CDM and is it actually effective? Specifically within the CDM, no. Oftentimes, we recommend or we will do as an exercise like a purple team or something like that after this as a way of, again, taking the next step. So, if we did a step after, attack, defend, and detect, it would be like a purple team or a red team. So I have this exercise, from the compliance perspective. I understand what I need. I'm checking to see if I have security controls to fill that need. I'm then making sure that on paper they work and they align to the threats that I'm facing. And then it would be an actual exercise. And you could even do something like Atomic Red Team, something internally where it's just, hypothesis shift and threat hunting, something of validating that these controls are actually working. So not specifically in the CDM, but that is a great exercise to do afterward. And I would say generally that's kind of where you're going to split from the compliance side. Compliance team doesn't really care. As long as it's there, you have that common language. The security team is, I need to make sure it's actually working and doing what it should be. So great question. Any other questions? Yes. They are moving really fast. I would say, generally speaking, if we're talking CDM here, there isn't much of a difference between building out the CDM if it's 20X or Rev 5. Again, I would say it's somewhat based on the priority there for the organization of kind of which way you're going, and then you would just kind of want to reorganize the thought process and what you're putting in to make sure that you're, again, either not going too far or not going far enough to make sure that you're kind of answering those questions. Oh, sorry, and the question there was, what is the, why I had Rev 5 there and not necessarily 20X? Is there really a difference there? Sorry. Any other questions? Yes?
Can you clarify on the defend taxonomy? Were you proposing a completely different taxonomy?
No. So the question around was the defend taxonomy. So defend is a project from MITRE. So it is an existing taxonomy. And really kind of the easiest way to think about it is it's the inverse of attack. So you're still using the attack matrix, and it's more of, if I have this tool or this defense, what can I detect against? But defend is a project from MITRE. Okay. Yes, yeah. If you're familiar with the Center for Threat Informed Defense, that's some of what they do as well when they're doing their evaluations, are actually looking at the defend as well. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. So where did you get your stats from to identify, detect, and recover
So where did the universal blind spot of detect, respond, and recover come from? Doing these over many, many years, and these are kind of the common areas, as well as looking at the requirements of the different frameworks. Generally speaking, they are light on those functions. So this isn't to say that all programs have gaps here. It's more of, when we're talking frameworks, generally speaking, they're more aligned to identify and protect. Any other questions? Yes. So the question was around, we talked today about CDMs for specific frameworks, but, a question around CDMs for specific areas. Yes, I mean, that's the flexibility of the CDM here is, again, I would say I wouldn't go crazy and do like 1 million CDMs because, it gets to a point where it's somewhat conflicting information. What is the source of truth? But yeah, I mean, if you're talking like, hey, I'm talking to the DevOps team, you could build one that's app specific and kind of aligned to DevSecOps. You could build one for your cloud team. You can really use this as a thought exercise to understand what other teams are doing, Because they might actually play a role in your defenses that you don't necessarily realize, or that you do realize and you want to put on paper. So yeah, I mean, the flexibility here is you can adapt to either different teams, again, the different asset classes, the rows are really very flexible. The one area that I would say is the columns. I would try to stick to a common column as much as you can, just to allow the translation of the information. If you have a bunch of different columns that we're talking different functional areas, you start to lose some of that transparency between like the interoperability. But again, the asset classes are really, you can kind of move them wherever. But yeah, like a great exercise to kind of show your defenses across multiple different teams and areas. Any other questions? Yes.
Failure modes. I've been doing this since '90. So we've seen startups come in, sell the product. It's basically the source of the compromise.
Yes.
We've seen mergers and acquisitions exactly the same, including $2 to $3 billion companies wiped off because of this whole issue. They had really good lawyers too. End of life, where basically companies say we're going to close down. They're not actually dealing with that data and other systems. And the vendor products you buy that may not be considered an IT device. And then finally, the economy. I've noticed every time we have a law in the economic problem, we don't want to see that in the C-suite.
Yes.
Basically will push this away. So I've been watching this cycle that maybe someplace we can actually insert this conversation.
I agree. I mean, more of a statement, and I'm not really going to be able to summarize all that for the recording, but all great points. I mean, some of the conversation yesterday was around, the fact of, the compromising the updates, the NPMs, there's a different transit for a lot of attacks here that isn't necessarily falling into what traditional security controls are looking at. So some of it is a paradigm shift, some of it is different techniques. Again, that's why I like to really layer in the, attack, defend, and detect, because, again, it isn't necessarily about just the CDM. It isn't just about what tools are in place for security controls. Sometimes it's the extra things that we're doing that, we want to make sure that we're getting credit for. Yes, the common, I have a tool and now it's not working anymore, or the company has gone bankrupt. Again, the hope would be here that by layering in some of that redundancy, or the question of everybody sitting there, we have all the answers, we're breaking for the day, and then that one guy raises his hand. What about this tool that we used 20 years ago that's still here? Okay, where does that fit in there, and how do we rip that out? Again, the overarching on any security program is budget. That is the boogeyman. That again, you can have a perfect security system, I wouldn't be able to do anything, so the business won't be able to operate, and then on the inverse, it's going to cost a lot of money. Nobody wants to pay for it. The hope with exercises like this is spread the spend out and actually be true with yourself of these are the things that I actually need. I don't need the A class, the A4 pluses tool in this area because it isn't really a priority for our organization. And yes, great, you went to a demo and they showed it to you and it was awesome and now you're really pushing for it. We already have 20 things that cover that. We don't need that. We could spend this a lot better elsewhere. So 100% across the board on everything you said. And really, I hope kind of the main takeaway here is again, the goal here is to put more ammo into your hands to have these conversations versus just being truly driven by that check mark that's required for the audit. And I know we're almost at time, so one last question. Okay, well, thank you all for your time. Appreciate you spending a little bit of time this Sunday with me. Thank you.